Hello and welcome back to GED Live at PALS. Today we're going to bring you a rather long video in which we're going to do the ultimate GED Social Studies study guide. This is not the complete GED Social Studies study guide, but more along the ultimate way to review quickly or to get to know all the basics of the history and civics that are critical for the test. Think of it as the Cliff Notes of the GED Social Studies Guide. Let's get going. So we're going to jump right in with history. I'm going to start with a group called the Sons of Liberty. During the colonial era, the colonists, or some of the colonists, were very unhappy with how the British Empire was treating them, especially abuses that they found were legislated in the Tea Acts and the Intolerable Acts. So the Sons of Liberty were a secret group of colonists who led a civil disobedience campaign against the crown. This was in response to the Intolerable Acts, things like taxation without representation or unjust taxes on goods produced in the colonies, or potential monopolies on goods such as the British East India Company's monopoly on tea, also the quartering of British troops and other injustices, abuses. They created pamphlets, harassed tax collectors and officials, incited protests, and they generally were leading a grassroots movement from taverns that eventually culminated in the Boston Tea Party, where they threw about, I believe it's $15 million equivalent worth of tea into the Boston Harbor, angering the crown very much. Members included Samuel Adams, Benedict Arnold, John Hancock, and Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry being the American who first uttered the words, "Give me liberty or give me death," and in his famous speech said, "I am not a Virginian, but an American," coining the term. After this, we get a group of individuals we refer to as the Founding Fathers. The Founding Fathers are very influential men who were extremely important in developing the ideas and the movement that led to what we now have in the United States. The Founding Fathers are a group of men who were influenced by the ideas of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment ideas sprung out of what was left of and taken away from the Renaissance in Europe and brought us new ideas in philosophy and economics. Using the political philosophy of John Locke, such as the idea of natural rights, they united the colonies in their efforts to form a republic and break away from the British Empire. Natural rights were a novel idea. Ever since the Middle Ages, the rights of men were given by kings. Kings were semi-divine or aligned with the church, and thus their right to rule was given by God, and that rule was continued on throughout their children hereditarily. They owned all the lands, the citizens were given rights. They weren't even citizens, the people, the subjects were given rights based on how the monarch saw fit. But John Locke's idea was that all men were created equal, and nobody had a special monopoly on the rights of liberty, and as such, those rights could not be taken away. Thomas Jefferson brought a copy of Adam Smith's Two Treatises of Government back from France, and the group applied these new ideas of free market capitalism to the American experiment. Another highly influential man, Benjamin Franklin, most notably known for his inventions, was largely responsible for forming an alliance with France by securing a treaty in 1778, and this sort of legitimized the colonists and their new country they were building. George Washington is perhaps the most famous leading member of this group. He was famous for leading the Continental Army, being the first president of the United States, and presiding over the Constitutional Convention in 1878. There were some other founding fathers who were no less important, and their names may also be familiar, such as John Adams, who went on to be the second president of the United States, Alexander Hamilton, who was what we would call the chief architect of the financial system, and also the first treasurer of the U.S., James Madison, who authored the Federalist Papers, and James Monroe, who later went on as the fifth president of the United States to push on with the westward expansion of the nation, bringing us closer to our sea to shining sea dream. So these founding fathers are extremely important. You'll notice throughout this that I've got key terms and people's names in bold. I've also given you a rough date range in the top right next to the headings. The next topic we can jump into is westward expansion. In the 19th century, America began to change. It was now its own country, and early America began expanding towards the Pacific Ocean, with the early exploration across the country to what is now the Pacific Northwest by the Lewis and Clark expedition in 1803. In that same year, the U.S. got a great deal with the Louisiana Purchase, and they nearly doubled the size of the country when the U.S. bought land from France for about $15 million. And that's going to bring us all the way almost over to the Rocky Mountain area. This idea of manifest destiny was super important. This idea in which Americans believed that it was their duty to expand from sea to shining sea and bring their democratic values and this agrarian way of life. Combined with that transcontinental railroad, they were able to continue this continental expansion all the way across the nation, going from the Atlantic to the Pacific Oceans. A key factor was the Industrial Revolution, which gave us the Transcontinental Railroad and railroad in general, as well as basically better weapons that we could use to, unfortunately, exterminate the buffalo and fight the native peoples who were living there. The next major event that tested the American experiment was the Civil War. So the Civil War began when abolitionist Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860. At this time, up to this time, there had been a sort of balance between the North, which were quote-unquote free states, and the South, which were quote-unquote slave states. They drew the Mason-Dixon line and tried to balance the amount of states to keep this voting power from going either way. However, the election of an abolitionist meaning someone who wanted to ban or end slavery, was just too much for the southern states. And so the secession of the southern states in response led to civil war. Secession means to leave. In the Civil War, the Union fought the Confederates in the South, the Union being the North, and the Union fought to keep the nation unified. Abraham Lincoln was of the view that the nation could not be divided. The shooting war began when the Confederates attacked Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The Union was far more equipped with nearly all of the manufacturing of guns in their territory, and they had a population advantage of about 22 million in the North to 9 million in the South. The South did have an advantage of fighting in their own territory, and they also benefited from highly capable officers like Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, and it was definitely not a one-sided fight. At each time I go to the next slide, you're welcome to pause the video and have a look and read through first before I talk about it if you'd like. So the end of the war was brought to a halt. But before that, Abraham Lincoln took his chance in 1863 to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. This document and speech was freeing the slaves in the South and encouraging them to join the war on the side of the Union. The end of the war left the South in devastation, with whole towns and farms razed. It's important to note that the majority of the fighting was brought to the South. Approximately 750,000 people lost their lives, mostly from disease, and the South suffered the majority of the losses. This accounted for about 2.5% of the entire American population at the time, which is a horrific thing for a society to go through. So after losing about 2.5% of the American population to this destructive war, it ended with the Union troops occupying the South and roughly 4 million newly freed slaves. There was legislation, and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments banned involuntary servitude, meaning slavery, made these newly freed African American slaves citizens, no longer slaves, and guaranteed their right to vote. It seemed like we're on the right track. However, Abraham Lincoln began Reconstruction, Reconstruction being this period of time in which we were going to bring the southern states back into the Union and rebuild all of that terrific damage that they had suffered. So between 1865 and 1877, this process took place. Abraham Lincoln attempted to bring the defeated Confederate States back into the Union with the 10% plan, in which 10% of the state's citizens had to pledge an oath to rejoin the Union. The attempts to integrate the African Americans were derailed, however, when President Lincoln was assassinated while watching a play. His predecessor, Andrew Johnson, who was his vice president, took the reins, and he ended the Reconstruction policies of Lincoln, giving the states the right to rebuild themselves. He was more of the idea that the states' rights were of importance. Many southern states, still stinging from this defeat and being forced to change their way of life, created black codes or Jim Crow laws that prevented African Americans from many things, including owning guns, land, or voting. And this led to mass poverty among that population and segregation, meaning they were separated from the rest of the white population in those southern states. This eventually culminated in the civil rights movement of the 1960s, roughly 100 years later. What I would call the last era of the older American history, and which is quite important because we're still establishing the amendments that really changed the way citizens executed their rights and got along with each other in our society, ends. After this, we've kind of completed the major changes to America regarding citizens' rights, especially suffrage, the right to vote. In the beginning, we simply have white men who can vote. It's not exactly equal and inclusive. However, we have seen now that African Americans who were freed from bondage and given the right to vote, even though they were oppressed in some manner by the states they lived in. And now we have the missing link, women. In the era after Reconstruction, America is pretty riddled with corruption. In this period, the United States went through a phase of cleaning up corruption and trying to improve living standards. Urbanization was unpredicted and messy, and after the Industrial Revolution, urbanization resulted in overcrowded, dirty, unsafe cities. So what government did was they worked to provide safer housing, and in order to protect workers, the Department of Labor and labor unions were formed. This gave workers' rights, some protection, and regulated some degree of safety for workers. Also, new regulation of the meat industry led to safer food for Americans. Finally, after we had a bunch of that corruption stomped out, the temperance movement, which was a movement trying to end excessive use of alcohol and vice, succeeded in getting the 18th Amendment passed. And this was marking the beginning of Prohibition, which banned the sale or consumption of alcohol nationwide. If you are an American now, living in America, it's pretty obvious if you watch the Super Bowl that there are beer ads all over the place and alcohol is legal. This being such a failure, Prohibition, resulting in massive crime and death, that it was later repealed. Nonetheless, it was an attempt to clean up, quote-unquote, American society. The last step in the progressive era was the efforts of activists like Susan B. Anthony and many other women and men finally led to universal suffrage, universal meaning complete and total for everyone, and suffrage, the right to vote, giving women the right to vote with the passing of the 19th Amendment in 1920. And here we see at the early 20th century, we have completed a lot of the United States history. Now I'd like to move on to civics. Let's talk about the two most important documents in civics, some of the ideas contained therein, and their parts. So the Declaration of Independence. When those colonists who felt so abused by King George III and who had fought the Sons of Liberty and the Founding Fathers, they had fought to work for a better role in the self-government in the colonies, were denied that and met with force and coercion, they decided it was too much to bear, and they put their new Enlightenment ideas into action. And they did so with the signing of the Declaration of Independence, which asserted that they were no longer a part of the British Empire. The Declaration of Independence is not a document creating laws. All it is a statement of their ideas, what they think has been done wrong to them, and their declaration of war, essentially. So we have 4 parts: the Preamble, the new theory of government, the grievances, and the Declaration of Freedom and Independence, or war. The Preamble is essentially an introduction line. It says why we're doing it. The new theory of government and the social contract explains this idea of natural rights, the social contract, and explains why they must do what they're doing. The grievances and the indictments of the king is a section that is claiming that the king has abused the people. They've gone beyond what is tolerable, and list all of those things which have been done wrong to them. Finally, we end with the Declaration of Freedom, Independence, and War, which states that we're free. We are no longer part of this empire, and de facto, we are at war. It's important to keep in mind that at this time, the British Empire was the largest army on the planet. And this small group of unhappy, discontent colonists were taking on a really extremely formidable force. This is a really brave act. The chance of success was quite minimal. But as we'll see, their advantages were used wisely. All right, let's start with the Preamble. So I've included some old language from the 18th century, how they would have said it, and then basically a translation for us modern English speakers. And so you can pause the video and read the left. That's exactly what they wrote into the Declaration of Independence. And now let's talk about it in a little more modern terms. So basically what this says is that when people decide as a group to separate from one political process to create a new one, especially when their rights are violated, it's their duty to fully explain why they are separating. So this group of people aren't just taking this lightly. They're saying, look, we know that when we have to leave, it's our duty to explain why. It cannot just be done randomly or at a whim. And what they do is they go on then to explain their new ideas. We've got these 3 main ideas which are called the new theory of government. You may hear the term natural rights, the rights of man, and then the social contract. The social contract being the idea that the power of the government rests in the people's acceptance of it, and that they allow themselves to be ruled by a government in exchange for protection. And so looking at the first part, you can pause and read all of the 3 parts on the left. Each of those paragraphs are useful to read. It's a good idea to get used to reading this 18th and 19th century language, because you will see passages on the test, and you're going to have to read those passages and answer questions about them. So even though it's tough, the more you practice, the easier it does get. It's kind of like speaking to someone in a different region. You just get used to how they talk. All right, so looking at the first paragraph, basically what they mean is that we believe that all people are equal to each other, and they're granted with certain rights by Creator, our God, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And no government should take that away. I mean, these guys are taking straight from a combination of Locke and Adam Smith, but hey, that was their right. They're just playing it by ear, right? The kings did the same thing when they took control. So they decided that this is the new status quo. We all have rights. You can't take them away. And you said before that you got your right from God, but hey, we're saying we got our right from God. In the second paragraph, they're saying basically that governments are created by the people and receive their powers from the people. Here we go. This is the social contract. And when a government abuses the rights of the people have the right to change or overthrow the government and create something new that will protect them and treat them civilly and fairly. So here it's really important to notice that they're saying abuses. These people were writing from the perspective that they felt unjustly and overly abused by the British Crown, and that they're asserting that all people deserve a fair civil standard of treatment. And they go beyond that into the third paragraph. Here we have, changing governments that have been around for a long time should not just occur without good reasons. So they're saying, look, we accept that we shouldn't just go around changing governments for no good reason, especially the longer they've been ruling and governing. But it is the nature of the people to deal with an unjust government rather than to change it. So we have to try to work out our differences and our conflict. However, if a government constantly abuses power to the point one person with absolute power, it is up to the people and even their right to get rid of the government in order to protect future generations. This contains some really key points that we see go on into the development of the Constitution, the beliefs in the American psyche today, and the rationale for their change. So this idea of one person, you can see when we move on to the Constitution next, that everything the Founding Fathers did was to try to prevent the concentration of power in a single person or entity. They thought this always led to tyranny. And if you read a lot of the writings of Jefferson, he was almost what we would consider borderline paranoid about this. And then why? Why was it so important? Why not just take it? Hey, we cannot sell our tea. It's not a big deal. We'll move on. We'll start selling lumber and stuff. No, because they wanted to protect posterity for future generations. They weren't just doing it for themselves. They were doing it to create a better society. And then we have the indictment of the king. They're basically saying, look, you can go ahead and pause and read the left. They're saying, look, we've tolerated the abuses of power by the king for long enough, and now it's time to change and get rid of the control of the king to establish a new government. But hey, before we do this, we're going to explain to the world why. Notice, they're explaining it to the world. This is key, and we'll see one of the articles showing that they really were concerned with how the world was going to see this. They are even honored to pay all their debts. We'll remember that Benjamin Franklin was going to secure the alliance of the French. The colonists knew they couldn't do this alone. And not only could they not do it alone, they were highly interrelated with Europe, as we'll see later in the French Revolution. These ideas were working together. This is a regional change, and the region of the colonies and Europe happened to be tied together through empire. So look, guys, before we change, we're going to explain why. Boom, list of grievances. I do not have the complete list here because it is extremely long. I encourage you to look online and read the original Declaration of Independence. Just practice reading all of these grievances. If you read them a few times and remember it, you'll start to see some themes popping up, because a lot of these grievances are written into the Bill of Rights to prevent this abuse again. So let's just look at a few here. So the British government dismantled colonial government many times in retaliation to protests. Here we see they're establishing that they believe it's a natural right to assemble, and that their representation being taken away from them is intolerable. Next, we have the colonists were forced to form their own forms of representative government after the assemblies were dissolved by the king. All right, so look, they said we had to create our own government. You got rid of our representative government, and we will not, as English citizens or colonists or men, be allowed to be ruled over without representation. This is kind of a result of the English Civil War. And next, the rights of life, liberty, and property. Here we see it's life, liberty, and property. This is the original phrasing that we have from the Enlightenment, are endangered when people are not allowed to form governments to protect them. They're establishing these basic rights already. These are going to go on to be embodied in the Constitution. The king disallowed migration to the colonies. Also, the colonists strongly believed that unused lands should be made available to anyone who can settle on them and make them productive. Here we can see they're getting a little bit restless because the king's trying to prevent their population from growing enough to be a danger, could defend itself, and they're starting to squabble over, hey, we have all this land around us, we are the ones living here, why can't we use it? And this is highly related to the rights to pursue property. All right, finally, they come to the end of the document and they just say it straight up bluntly. We declare ourselves independent from Great Britain. We are no longer associated with the king or parliament or do we recognize their authority over us. We are a new nation and we have the rights of an independent nation. That's it. They're saying we are independent. Of course, that does lead to war when you declare your independence from the greatest military power on earth. You can expect that there will be war. But here, they say at the end, all who have signed this declaration promise to support our independence with our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. That is essentially a declaration of war, saying they're willing to sacrifice their lives and give up everything to create this new nation. So the Declaration of Independence, a really important and strongly worded document, changing things forever. And after that, we do have a little period where they create a different sort of government. We call it the Constitution 1.0, that kind of failed, known as the Articles of Confederation. I encourage you to look it up, but basically it had one branch of government, had no way to tax, couldn't regulate trade, and the economy fell apart. Eventually this led to Shays' Rebellion, which was put down by private army hired by wealthy Bostonians, and the Founding Fathers said, hey, we are going back to the drawing board, it's time to start the Constitution. And they enshrined these 6 really big, important ideas into the Constitution. These ideas are influenced by their experiences with King George III and the British Empire, and with the ideas of the Enlightenment. And then they have their own little battle going on between who should be more important, the federal government or the state government. But they work this out in their own ways. These are some big ideas. So 1, limited government. The government does not just have all power. The government has the power that is given. So limited government is a pretty big difference from the rights of people in a absolute monarchy, whereas in that situation, the absolute monarch has all the power and the subjects are given the rights they are given. In this case, the Constitution enshrines the idea that the government is in a box and it is given the power it is given by the Constitution. And then we have republicanism. This almost goes back to the Roman Empire in some ways, but it says that public opinion reflects voters who elect officials who are most informed about the issues. And so we know that when we have now 330 million people, we're not all educated enough on the issues, and we don't all have enough free time to become educated and debate them ourselves. We have to do things like build roads and computers and serve dinner, and there are tons of jobs to be done, so we are busy. So what do? We hire officials who are supposed to be the most informed about these issues to vote on our behalf. A great idea in the system was checks and balances. As I said, they were really afraid of the accumulation of power in one individual or entity, and thus they set up those 3 branches of government so that each of them could check each other's power and make sure that no one branch became too powerful. And they wanted to make sure that the political power was not concentrated in any one area of the government. Federalism. I could make a whole video about this, but we'll try to sum it up. There's a working relationship between the federal and state governments. And so basically we have a separation of powers between the federal and the state governments and even local governments, but they also share powers. Basically, these things are broken up to achieve different things, but they all work together. And eventually this turned out to be federal law trumps state law in most cases, but anything not given to the federal government is the state's power. Separation of powers, this goes back to checks and balances. Instead of stopping each other from abusing powers, each of the branches, the legislative, the executive, and the judicial, all have their own bodies, and they are all given different duties and powers, things that they can govern. And finally, popular sovereignty, and this is the idea that the government gets its power from the people. It is the people who are the owners of the nation, and the government is allowed to rule over us in exchange for protection. Moving on. The Constitution is made up of 3 parts. We're at the Preamble, the Articles, and the Amendments. Whereas the Declaration of Independence is sort of like a statement, you can almost view the Constitution as a standard operating procedure, like an SOP for a business. Basically, it organizes the government, which is run as an institution, and the Constitution is creating it. So if we were to think about the Articles first, the Articles are where the Founding Fathers sat down together and figured out how the government was going to be run. Basically, they built the government. If you were creating a company, you'd give each other titles and you'd give each other a job description, and then we'd have a SOP stating how much you get paid and your pay rate structure and how you could do things and what you were not allowed to do, what would happen if these things were violated. The Constitution is exactly the same. So each article is telling each branch their powers, which ways they check the other branch, how they function, even their pay and how they're elected. So the first article set up the legislative branch. Bingo, we've got 1. The second article set up the executive branch. We've got 2. And the third article set up the judicial branch. Now the 3 branches of government are complete. We have a government that can run things. Next, the fourth article was kind of establishing state powers. Basically saying that, any power that wasn't given to the legislative government, the federal government, that's going to remain the state's power. The fifth article was basically understanding and allowing for change. The Founding Fathers realized in their wisdom that this thing was going to need to be changed to suit different situations, iron things out, and adapt to how the nation changed. So they set up the process for amendment. The sixth article, the Supremacy Clause, is basically saying that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. No law can trump the Constitution, and all of those in the nation under any of its organizations or in any role are bound to the Constitution to uphold it and abide by it. Ironically, there's a section in the Supremacy Clause that I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but I read if I understand it correctly, says that America will always pay its debts as well, so America, by Constitution, is bound to pay its debts to foreign nations, which I assume is probably to assure our European allies that we would be a functioning and trustworthy player in international trade. Finally, the seventh article is ratification, putting this document into power. Boom, it is done. We now have a constitution and a new government that is much better, far superior to the Articles of Confederation. After this was done, the Founding Fathers did not waste any time, and there was a great debate. Should we leave it like this? It's complete, isn't it? But in the end, those who would like to establish some basic rights prevailed, and we get what is known as the Bill of Rights. They just went ahead and started making amendments. And the first 10 amendments of the Constitution are what we would call the Bill of Rights. And these amendments are highly indicative of the fear of power and tyranny and the trauma from the experiences of the treatment by the British Empire. These people are basically creating rights to prevent things that have been done to them from never happening again, and combining them with the ideas of the Enlightenment. So bingo, the First Amendment. Thing to remember, 5 freedoms. This contains the 5 freedoms. So what do we get? We get those basic rights that everyone should hold in high esteem. And they chose it as the First Amendment, so I think we could possibly assume that they meant these were the most important rights. Otherwise, it probably would have come as the Third or the Fourth Amendment. So what do we get? The 5 freedoms are nothing in a law that Congress makes shall establish something that violates our right to religion, freedom of speech, assembly, meaning to protest, to publish, and petition the government. So this sets up all of our freedom of speech on an individual level, the rights of religion and not being persecuted based on what we believe, the right for the press to say what they feel is true without slandering anyone, and then the right for us to protest if need be, and then petition the government. I mean, go ahead. Start today. You can write your senators and representatives letters expressing your ideas. We still have that level of communication even in 2021. And the Second Amendment, which they chose second, was protecting the right of the citizens to possess firearms. If you read it in the official language, it says some things that are a little more, a little different, like the right to bear arms and something about a regulated militia. Anyway, that's a contentious one, but they thought it was very important because they put it in number 2. The Third Amendment guarantees that the Army cannot force homeowners to give them room and board without permission. And if we've studied the colonial history and the Revolutionary War, this is obviously a legacy of that quartering of troops in which people were made to give up businesses for a time being to allow soldiers to quarter, British soldiers. This left a big mark on them, and they wanted to make sure that wasn't repeated in the Republic. Next we have the Fourth through the Eighth Amendment. You can go ahead and pause them and think about, what do these have in common? So if you've had a chance to read this, the Fourth through the Fifth Amendments are what we would call the rights of the accused. And so we don't really need to go into detail about each of these. What we know is that the Fourth through the Eighth Amendments are all protecting the rights of individuals accused of crimes. And so there were some really unethical things that went on in the colonial period that the colonists found to be particularly abusive, such as taking people committing crimes in the colonies against the crown, shipping them to England to be tried by a jury that was not of their peers, but of those who may not hold them in high esteem. Searching things without probable cause. There were abuses and ways in which they were treated regarding crime that they did not feel were right. So what they did is they set up the Fourth, Fifth, Sixth, Seventh, and Eighth Amendments to make sure that people couldn't be searched without reason. People couldn't be held indefinitely for a crime. They couldn't be forced to testify against themselves. Their property couldn't be taken out without fair compensation. Things that they were not to be kept in trial, and they would not to be kept in jail, but they were to be guaranteed a speedy trial. You'll notice they have an impartial jury. You have the right to a lawyer, an attorney. They also guaranteed a jury trial in these federal civil court cases. And this is to make sure that our peers judge us and not someone who could be biased in the government. And then finally, the Eighth Amendment is guaranteeing us that all of our punishments must be fair and not cruel, and that they could not use punishments as a way to dissuade us from executing our rights. Finally, we get the Ninth and 10th Amendments rounding out the Bill of Rights. So basically the Ninth Amendment is kind of a way to sum it all up for all the stuff we didn't include in there. So basically it says that anything, all rights, even though they're not listed here, doesn't mean they can be violated. So there are no exceptions. Everything outside of this box that we have not said is the right of the people, and that shall not be violated. And then the 10th Amendment says that everything that's not granted to the federal government, any right, any power, is granted to the states or the people. And so that means that if the federal government doesn't have regulation for it, legislation for it, states do have the power to regulate that on their own. Again, this was part of the concept of federalism and keeping government limited. Limited government and federalism are important ideas within the Constitution. And so, like I said, this is not a complete study guide for social studies, but it is totally the ultimate one-go social studies guide. If you were to study all of this, go back, read those slides, take some notes on all the bold terms, memorize those, do some deep diving on the subjects, you'd be pretty ready for the civics and the U.S. history components of the GED social studies exam. You definitely want to move on, go into World War I through the Cold War, a little bit of post 9/11 era, but that's it. I hope that you guys have benefited from this, and I'm happy to help. As always, I wish you the best of luck in your GED test taking experience. Take care.